In this video, we will discuss the origins and history of Hinduism. When we have talked about origins of religious traditions in the past in this course, we have had a founder, or an event, or a text, perhaps, that begins the tradition. When we talk about Hinduism, however, we do not have any formal beginning or foundation for the tradition. Jeffrey Broad notes, quote, "Hinduism is made up of many sects with a variety of belief systems," end quote. Some consider Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs to be Hindus, as well as the people we might consider Hindus today. So when we talk about Hinduism as a religious tradition, we are met with some difficulty in determining what is Hinduism and what is not, and how far back it dates. By most accounts, Hinduism appears to date back to the Indus Valley civilization, which begins as early as 3000 BCE. In the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley, there are some images that resemble Shiva, the Hindu god, and there are other bits of archaeological evidence, like a sacred pool, that indicate the Hindu tradition might date back to at least this time. You can see on the right here the seal that has an image of what appears to be at least an ancestor or a beginning idea of the god of Shiva. Whether the Hindu tradition dates back to the Indus Valley civilization period, we cannot be sure, but we do know that by the Vedic period, we begin to have this tradition develop. The Vedic period comes from the name for the text, Vedas, and literally means knowledge. This period begins around 2000 BCE, and we see it begin with Indo-European groups who called themselves Aryans, literally meaning noble ones, who moved into India at this time, with a language that was the ancestor to Sanskrit, which is what the Vedas are written in. This is often called the Vedic period because it's when the Vedas are written, and Vedic religion focused primarily on ritual sacrifice, often through fire and/or using soma. The fire was considered a god called Agni, who's a gateway to other deities. They would use soma, which was a plant that they would extract juice from, and may or may not have had hallucinogenic properties or ecstatic-like properties based on what we can tell, since we do not have the plant today. We do know that this was used in ritually sacrificing to Agni at this point. During the Vedic period, particularly towards the beginning, Indra was considered to be the most powerful deity. During the Vedic period is when the caste system begins to develop. In the caste system, there are 4 castes, or varnas, that are considered to be how society is structured. This goes from the most important or closest to the deities to the least important, and further down to those who are considered untouchable or outcasts. We'll talk more about reincarnation and that idea in the living tradition video later in the course. But the caste system is typically where we see the idea of reincarnation come in. Those who have achieved their dharma will be reincarnated eventually into a higher caste, while those who do not are reincarnated in the lower caste. The 4 main varnas begin with the Brahmins. And the Brahmins are the priestly caste. The Kshatriyas are the kings, rulers, warriors, princes, and so on. The Vaishyas are the merchants, craftsmen, landowners, skilled workers, and those who are not royalty, not knights or warriors, but still have an important role to play in the civilization. Whereas the Shudras are the lowest caste, and are those who work on farms, or are servants, perhaps apprentices, those who are not the ones who actually are running the businesses or being the merchants or craftsmen, but maybe those assisting them. The Dalits are not part of the caste system as a whole, but rather are those who are considered untouchable in the sense of purity. Just like we see in Judaism, there's a major emphasis on purity and holiness in Hinduism, and we see this primarily through the caste system. The Dalits are considered to be untouchable or outcasts because of this idea that they have not achieved their dharma in other times and have been reincarnated into a lower caste. We see these people as those who clean up the streets, waste, those who touch and deal with dead bodies, and so on. As we move into the Puranic, classical, or even epic period of Hinduism, we see a bit of a shift in what Hinduism looks like. The Puranic period is named for the Puranas, which we'll talk about in the scripture video for this course. And Purana literally means old or ancient. In this period, beginning around the 10th century BCE, we start to see a focus less on ritual activity and simply worshipping and sacrificing to the gods, and more on philosophy and intellectual thought. We see this in the Upanishads. The Upanishads focus on the meanings behind the rituals that they do and emphasize meditation instead of outward sacrifice. The focus is on inward action rather than outward sacrificing to the gods. We see a discussion here of the concept of Om. Om is believed to be the sacred syllable, as you can see represented in Sanskrit to the right here. Om is believed to be, in some way, Brahma, the ultimate reality or ultimate God, as a syllable or a sound. This would be used in meditation to remember and to connect to the ultimate reality or the sacred. As I've mentioned earlier, this idea of dharma, we see that later Hindu thought and literature particularly develops the idea of dharma, which literally means right action. Dharma is based a lot on the caste system, so we do not see the idea of dharma develop in the Vedic period quite as much. But during this period, we see the idea of doing what's right based on somebody's caste or setup. So somebody who's a warrior would not perform the same actions to achieve their dharma or right action that somebody who is a Shudra would. We also see an important and new idea of bhakti. Bhakti is the idea of individual devotion, literally means devotion, to gods and goddesses. One of the things that helps achieve this is literature being written in the vernacular, like Tamil, instead of in Sanskrit, which is the ancient language we see the Vedas and Puranas, so on, written in. Bhakti is one of the things that we see develop from this period onward, and we still see in modern Hinduism today, as Hindus will typically devote themselves to one particular god or a few multiple gods and goddesses. As Hinduism develops after the Puranic period, we see again a few changes. We start to see different branches of Hinduism in some ways. Beginning around the 5th century BCE, we see Buddhism and Jainism, which rise out of Buddhism as eventually separate traditions, much like we see Christianity rise out of Judaism as a separate tradition. Today, we usually consider Buddhism and Jainism to be separate religions, but at this point, both the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who we'll talk about later, was Hindu and developed a tradition that was just slightly different from Hinduism. Jainism begins as an idea that there's not really a god or gods out there, and that the world has always been. While there's a lot of the same beliefs as in Hinduism, there's a rejection of theism. During the Gupta Empire, which was from about 320 to 540 CE, Hinduism developed significantly, the creations of epics, temples, and the establishment of Vishnu as the chief god. Vishnu, who you can see depicted on the right here, is usually believed to be the protector god, who is part of a threefold idea of God, or the chief deities, with Shiva as the destroyer god, and sometimes Brahma as the creator god, or instead Devi as the goddess. With Vishnu being the chief god during this period, the royalty worshipped him. And we see the idea of bhakti, remember this idea of individual devotion, as a way out of samsara, or the cycle of birth and rebirth. Before this, there were different emphases on how one could achieve moksha, or enlightenment, and get out of the cycle of samsara. But as Hinduism develops later, the idea that bhakti is a way to achieve this is relatively unique. We also see some conflicts between Hinduism and other traditions later on. While there is an idea of Hindu nationalism called Hindutva, this does not develop until later, and Hinduism as a political movement does not really happen much in the ancient and even early modern world. However, with movements like Islam and Christianity, we do see an emphasis on tying the political with the religious. And this impacts Hinduism quite a bit, as the Muslims during the Mughal Empire try to take over. However, they tend to be more accepting of Hinduism during this time, and this may even be when the Sufi movement develops. We also see Christianity later with the idea of missionaries going in and trying to convert Hindus, particularly because they believe that they worship idols with the idea of having multiple gods. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the origins of Hinduism and the characteristics of the Vedic period, describe and identify the varnas of the caste system, evaluate the change in Hinduism from the Vedic period to the Puranic and classical period and onward.